Canada is a little bit unique in terms of the politicization of defense investment decisions. We've seen some really egregious examples of political considerations completely obliterating any sense of the national interest in how things have been decided.
This is the Expert Series podcast from the CDA Institute, Canada's premier defense and security think tank. I'm Josh Malm, and it's Thursday, July 2nd, 2025.
We need to do much more to secure our borders, to secure our Arctic, to secure Canada. So we're going to need to spend more. We recognize that. Now we're going to do it in a way that is in the best interests of Canada, with partners on which we can rely, get best value for money, but also make more of that investment here in Canada so we're growing jobs and livelihoods in our own country. We're spending over 75 cents on every dollar of capital spend for defense goes to the United States.
Charles Davies joined us to discuss the big picture of Canada's defense strategy, governance, and accountability, framed through the lens of his new book, True North Strong. A longtime senior fellow at the CDA Institute, Davies brings decades of experience and insight into how defense is managed, funded, and understood by Canadians. Together, we talked about a number of key themes: the urgent need for strategic management of defense capabilities, the role of recapitalization spending in sustaining Canada's military effectiveness, the power of an informed and engaged citizenry in holding government accountable, and the case for a realistic Canadian grand strategy in a volatile global order. True North Strong aims to provide ordinary Canadians with a plain language and readable guidebook to help them answer these questions and make informed judgments on defense issues. It does not try to influence how they look at the institution or suggest what they should think about it. Colonel Charles Davies, or Chuck Davies, served for 38 years in the CAF and a further 5 years as a civilian executive in D&D. He attended CMR and graduated RMC Centennial Class of 1976 with a degree in history. We have a long discussion ahead about some of the details of the book you just released. But before we get to that, I am hoping you can give our audience a bit of a primer on who you are and go through your experiences in government D&D a little bit.
Sure. So thanks very much, Josh. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. So my background is a bit odd, which is one of the reasons why I guess I got the chutzpah to think I could do this. I was early on in my military career, I was tapped to go and study applied technology, and then that caused me to be working in procurement and major projects for a while. And then in the 1990s, when we had the major downsizing of national defense, I somehow found myself in the middle of that, re-engineering of the national defense command control and strategic management frameworks. And that led me to some other interesting employment in a number of places, setting up the Army's new Darkton and training organization, which led me into Army headquarters as a colonel, as a director of land force structure, responsible for reshaping the field army, director of land service support. And then I came back into the materiel business as the strategic planning director for D&D's material group at a time when there was a lot of stuff happening. We were in Afghanistan. We were trying to rebuild the procurement and complex project management expertise that had been lost in the major downsizing a decade before. And when I left, took my uniform off, I became a public service civilian and found myself for 3 years as the senior director responsible for material acquisition and support policies, business processes, and standards across the department. And in that job, I also chaired the NATO committee, which oversees the equipment lifecycle management policies within the alliance. And I had also served for 3 years as the logistics branch advisor, logistics branch now being the Royal Canadian Logistics Service. And I was responsible for advising the senior leadership of the department on personnel and training and related issues. And for the last more than a decade now, I've been a fellow, and I guess you call me a senior fellow now because I've been around for so long, with the CDA Institute doing research and writing on defense issues. So that's kind of who I am. And if I could just comment a bit on why I felt that there's a place in the country for a book like this, and it's from observing the public debate about defense issues. They're quite often they're missing what I think is essential context and understanding of the issues themselves. And when I look around, there was not much out there to help people make sense of defense issues, the ordinary people. So my intent is to contribute to a better informed public debate. Tried desperately to avoid advocating for particular defense objectives, more or less defense spending, anything like that, and simply inform people so they can make up their own minds. But what I do advocate for is an informed and engaged citizenry. I talk a lot about that in the book. And then hoping to help citizens assess how well or not the governments they elect are doing the job of managing defense. They make up their own minds about that. And then finally, I needed to clear my mind out of 10 years of research doing that side of that sort of stuff. So that's basically who I am and why I wrote the book.
Well, you've had a long and storied career, Chuck, and you've had lots of diverse experiences within the general field of Canadian defense and security, different positions, different government departments, and different experiences. And your book, True North Strong, it's really a wonderful book. I read it in anticipation of our interview, so my intent is to kind of help walk with yourself and our audience through some of what I interpreted were the major contours of the book. So this podcast can hopefully be a bit of a companion piece for it. So with that said, you open the book, I think, by placing Canada's defense challenges within what is a rapidly deteriorating global environment, rising authoritarianism, global instability, threats to democracy. How do you see trends like these reshaping the expectations, if at all, placed on Canada's national defense institutions?
Yeah, so what it's doing fundamentally, it is shifting the national perspective about defense and defense spending. Certainly up until a few years ago, very few years ago, there was not much interest in Canadian society in seeing any defense spending in some cases, or certainly not more defense spending. They were, people are generally happy to see the Canadian Armed Forces come and, during floods or fires or whatever kind of response they have to make during the pandemic. The military had a big role, widely embraced by the public. So the Canadian Armed Forces is highly respected, but wanting to see them sort of in the background when we don't need them. Just they call and the Canadian Armed Forces comes and does great things, but then go away. We don't need you anymore. It's been kind of the attitude. That's changed dramatically since the Russians invaded Ukraine. And the realization is more and more people are coming to the realization that we need to look to our own defense, and then certainly the activities of President Trump in the last few months, very few months, has added concern and anxiety to many people about the state of the nation's defense capabilities, and frankly, other instruments of state power as well for influencing the world around us. Although defense seems to be the obvious sort of lightning rod piece that most people's minds gravitate to.
I'm hoping to kind of granularly go through some of the different sections of your book, Chuck. But maybe you can help describe what exactly some of the key pillars of your book are. So I note that part one, there's a sketched portrait of national defense, what it is, what it does. Then we go to stewardship and oversight of national defense. And then part three is explorations. We get into defense industrial base, procurement, defense by the numbers, mission planning and execution. So maybe you could kind of briefly walk us through the structure and how you put it together and why, and then from there we can kind of pick at it a little bit.
Absolutely. So I took for sort of inspiration for the structure of the book, a travel guide. And I have a few of those, and so I started with that. So the sketch portrait of national defense is really basic outline, what it is and what it does. And a sketch portrait doesn't have a lot of detail. It has sort of the basic essentials that the artist uses to show his audience or her audience the bare bones and the important elements of what they're portraying. So what it is it's a multi-headed thing. It's two principal heads. There's a Defense Department, and then there's a Canadian Armed Forces. And what it does is there are just four things that the national defense does. So one is it provides advice to government. Two, it conducts force development, which is the imagination and creation of a future force. It does force generation, which is essentially the management of the existing force and the preparation of force packages for operations, and then it conducts operations. And when you look at it that way, it becomes easier to understand how well it is doing it's fulfilling its mandate. So that sort of sets the groundwork for the citizen to begin to focus on the things that will give them the best picture about how well it's being managed and how well it's performing its responsibilities. Then I talk about the governance, the stewardship and oversight. And stewardship is an important concept for me. And I can talk a little bit more about that, but essentially, government of the day, in my view, is the steward of these great national assets like national defense, not only national defense. And the steward is responsible for care of that item on behalf of the owner, and the owner in this case, and the people of Canada. So I talk a lot about this stewardship idea and how it needs to work effectively, and how flesh out the concept as much as I can. And then there's a chapter on examples of government stewardship, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And there are two or three really ugly ones. And there are several good ones, and they need to be understood, and they help provide a good context for viewing how today's governments are performing. And then finally, there's a major chapter on citizen guardian. The citizen, the informed and engaged citizen, is kind of the linchpin of everything. They're the ones who collectively pass judgment on the performance of the government. So the third part then goes into individual explorations or destinations, as I've termed it sometimes, in specific areas, and a reader can read any one of those things. They're a standalone chapter. Each of those 5 chapters is standalone. So Canada, the world, and the 2% debate, trying to put a context around the decision-making in the public debate about how much defense is enough for Canada. Then, as you say, mission planning and execution, explain how that stuff works. It's always talking about defense procurement. So I've got a large chapter on defense procurement and, again, defense industries. And then a defense by the numbers is a financial and numerical statistical analysis of what the numbers tell us about the institution.
And we will go through all of that sort of point by point, defense industrial base, procurement, the mechanics of government. Before we get deep in the weeds, I kind of want to go with another bigger picture question, which is brought up in the beginning, and that's sort of grand strategy, if you will. So we've seen increased discussion in Canada about the need for some kind of coherent, overarching strategy. Based on your experience in military and civilian arms of national defense, what would be the essential ingredients of a realistic and distinctly Canadian grand strategy, if you will, in today's rapidly shifting global security environment?
Okay. So that's a small question. So that's a tough one, and I actually didn't tackle that substantially in the book, but I think indirectly there are elements of that that are touched on there. So there are actually here's a thought. Let's first of all drop the fiction of a small country punching above its weight. Let's realize that we are not a small country. Our economy is among the top 10 in the world, and it's bigger than that of Russia. Now think about that. Canadian economy is bigger than that of Russia. Our population, 41 million, is in the top quartile of nations, among nations. It's actually in about the top 20% among nations. But it's importantly, there's a qualitative characteristic about Canada's population. First of all, almost a quarter of us were not born in this country. So we're globally connected. And we have a very, very broad diversity of connections globally. Family connections, business connections, and all of that. We're also among the best educated, probably the best educated country in the world from when you look at all population groups. So younger people, there are countries which have very high levels of advanced education for younger people, but not so much in the older generations. In Canada, it's pretty universal, top to bottom. The number of people who have tertiary education, the percentage of our population with tertiary education, which means could be university, could be college, could be training after high school. So we are about the most well-educated country in the world. So we have a lot going for us, and so we're not a small player. We're not the U.S. We're not China. We're not even Germany or Japan, but we can swim with the big fish, and we should. First and foremost responsibility for this country is to defend itself and to defend North America in concert with our American neighbors. Whether we like it or not, we can't move. We have to cooperate with our neighbors. That defense of Canada and defending North America is job one. They are no-fail tasks. Both of them are no-fail tasks for this country. We cannot afford to not do those things effectively. And there are two aspects of the North American defense. One is, protecting ourselves collectively, are the two countries. But the other is protecting and preserving our sovereignty, because the U.S. will quite legitimately move in and do what they have to do for their own defense over and within Canadian territory, if necessary, if we're not doing it, and if they don't believe that we are doing it. So we have to be credible and we have to be effective in the defense of Canada and the defense of North America over anything else we do. If we don't spend enough money to do everything else we want to do, we have to resource those functions right away, off the top of everything else. Job number two is contributing to global stability, because we are a trading nation. Our economic power, our economic survival depends on international trade, and that requires global stability. So it's very important to us that we contribute to the maintenance of global stability. And we are also a member of NATO, and there are international activities like the mission in Latvia, which are not necessarily no-fail for Canada as a nation, but they are no-fail for NATO, and we are a founding member of NATO, and we have to do what we can to make sure that mission is successful. So in terms of a strategic approach to defense, I would say we need to understand exactly who we are and what we really are in the world. We need to understand what our defense priorities are, and I outlined the ones that make the most sense to me. Everything else below those two, defending Canada and North America and contributing to global stability, are nice to do's, and where they don't necessarily directly contribute to one or two, the first two, then maybe we need to take a hard look at whether they're important to us. The other thing that I think we need to consider in developing a strategic approach to defense and security is that national reputation matters. And Canada has a very good reputation in some measures. So there's a best country sort of study that's done every year. We always rank up near the top 1, 2, 3. There is Transparency International publishes an annual study of the of how safe and secure countries are with for in terms of doing business there, and how fair their systems are, and we rank up pretty well up there in that one as well. Where we have fallen down many times in over the years is our leadership makes commitments and we don't follow them, we don't implement them. So we committed to being more active in United Nations operations around the world, and we hadn't really done that. We committed in 2014 and every couple of years after that to spend 2% of our GDP on defense and security, and we're still not doing that. We have endorsed international standards for foreign aid spending, and we don't do that. So reputation matters. I think we need to fall back on a business dictum, which is promise only what you can deliver and deliver what you promise. And that should be a fundamental principle in the development of national strategies. And the final thing I would say is we need to get government to move off of its largely transactional approach to managing the defense capabilities of the nation, and move it into a strategic management approach. And I can talk about what that looks like if you like.
Sure. Maybe you can touch on strategic management, and then after that we can get a bit more into a few other areas.
Sure. So managing strategically starts with understanding that defense capabilities are integrated fusions of personnel, equipment, infrastructure, and then there's an institutional, intellectual component of professional knowledge. And each of these capability elements has to be managed on a whole life basis, from original concept right through to their retirement at the end of using them. So personnel means you're tracking demographic trends, you're looking ahead, you're adapting recruiting or training or whatever to meet predicted needs, to deal with predicted issues, and to adapt the people part of capability to the future. Equipment and infrastructure, you need to manage based on the estimated life expectancy. Every piece of equipment, every piece of infrastructure has an estimated life expectancy that tells you this is how long this will be effective and can be supported. It's an estimate, and that can be adjusted as it goes through life, but you know exactly when you need to start making decisions about midlife updates or investments in replacement, or make a determination that, well, we're not going to maintain this capability in the future and we're going to just take it out of service. So those decisions have to be made early enough to make sure that the legacy systems are replaced with whatever's coming next before they rust out and become ineffective. And we have lots and lots of experience with its systems rusting out and becoming ineffective. In terms of professional knowledge, you need, if anything, the Russia Ukraine war has really emphasized the importance of professional knowledge. The Russians were awful and intellectually bankrupt at the start of that war. They're learning the hard way. The estimates are that they've had about 1 million casualties, about a quarter of them dead. That's a tough way to learn, to relearn how to fight properly. So the importance of maintaining that professional knowledge and within the institution, focusing on future trends and resilience and adaptability to unexpected change, and that's all done through there's the Canadian Armed Forces have the Canadian Forces College with the three. Basically a national defense university with 3 centers. It has doctrine centers. It has warfare centers that do experimentation. So they do a good job of that, but it all needs to be tracked, managed, and planned from the very beginning of thinking about what the capability is going to look like or needs to look like, and then right through its life and then on to the end. And there needs to be, finally, in addition to this long-term whole life management, there needs to be a proper funding balance between the elements of capability. So personnel, spending on personnel, on operations and maintenance spending, and recapitalization of your equipment and infrastructure, that has to be in balance. And in terms of Canada, that spending, in particular on recapitalization, needs to be looked at very carefully. NATO has a target of 20% of budget on spending on recapitalization. Canada needs to spend more than that because NATO's number is based on the whole of the alliance, and most of the countries in the alliance are either totally landlocked or have very limited maritime and air areas to cover. Canada has huge maritime and air approaches to cover. Navies and air forces do that, go to the maritime and air domains. Navies and air forces are very capital intensive. Armies are personnel intensive. And so we have to be spending like 25, 30, 35% on recapitalization on a consistent basis to avoid the kind of rust out we've seen in the past. Australia, roughly comparable challenges to Canada's currently, or in the last budget year, was spending 35%. That's roughly where the U.S. typically is. So we need to be somewhere north of 25% spending on recapitalization. So that's managing strategically.
One of the persistent criticisms we hear about Canada's defense institutions is that there's too much tail, as you call it, too much bureaucracy, too many headquarters and staff, not enough teeth in terms of deployable, maybe frontline military power. But in the book, you seem to push against this narrative a little bit. You know, like what might be dismissed as overhead is actually potentially a necessary sort of route as part of a system. Everything from recruitment and training to procurement and infrastructure. So can you unpack this for us? And, what do Canadians need to better understand about how modern military works?
Right. So, yeah. So there is overhead is not necessarily unnecessary overhead. There is necessary overhead. So modern militaries need to have fairly extensive training and professional development systems. Certainly in the past, up to and including World War II, you could recruit young, mostly men in those wars. You could conscript them. You can give them a few weeks or months of training, but then they do a lot of on the job learning when they actually go into combat for the first time, and that's expensive in terms of the blood and treasure of the nation. So modern militaries invest a lot of time and effort on the training, the fundamental training of people. In the Canadian Armed Forces, it takes about 31 weeks to train an infantryman uh, from a recruit that walks in the door. So that goes through basic training, some field skills training, and then basic infantry training. It can take over 40 weeks to train an air weapon systems technician, for example. And that just gets you an individual who's ready to join a team. And then that team is going to go through progressively larger team training and team of teams training, and turning a group of individuals into a combat team or a battle group or a brigade that's ready to actually conduct operations. So, and similarly, on the materiel side, equipment and supplies and services and all of that, there's an infrastructure that's required behind that to ensure that the right equipment is being provided in the right quantities, it's maintained to the right standard, so it works when it's needed. And so that all that stuff that happens behind the sharp end of the spear is not, it's not superfluous activity. It's necessary, critical activity. It's more in the system of the way I've described it. It's not tail. It's a system of roots that nourishes and enables the tree to exist and to grow. And without those roots, it would wither away and die. So there needs to be an understanding that there is a certain amount of supporting infrastructure that's absolutely necessary. Also, national defense is not a standalone entity. It exists within a wider government structure. And there's a certain requirement in order to just get stuff done in the federal bureaucracy, you need to have an executive, a leadership team that's able to plan and sponsor and explain the often very unique requirements of national defense to other government departments, to central agencies, and to get approval for everything that they do. And we may not like, the amount of bureaucracy that's involved in that, but it is what it is. And the defense doesn't get to not play that game. It's vitally important that they have an adequate management team that's focused on getting the warfighters the right stuff, which is supported by the right policy solutions, supported by the right capabilities to keep them effective. Getting a simple pay change, it's just a small pay increase through to improve recruiting and retention and all of that. That's not a defense decision. That's a Treasury Board decision. And there's a big whole process around how you seek those authorities. There's also a bunch of oversight bodies. So there's the Parliamentary Budget Office, and there's the Auditor General, and there's a Privacy Commissioner, and all these other folks that do important work on behalf of the Parliament of Canada and the people of Canada to assure that their government is working effectively. And that there's a major level of effort required in all organizations to file the reports that these organizations demand on an ongoing basis. Now, there are critics, very knowledgeable critics, who think that some of this reporting regime is a bit rich for what Canada really needs. But again, defense doesn't get to choose and pick which ones it wants to do or how much it wants to respond to them. As long as they're there, the national defense has to be there responding properly to the requirements that are set by Parliament and the Government of Canada.
Given that sometimes major defense acquisitions can become somewhat political in nature. How can governments or our government best ensure that defense procurement decisions remain strategically sound and perhaps a bit more insulated from the sort of threat or challenge or short-term political pressures, and what kind of mechanisms could potentially improve that process?
So Canada is a little bit unique in terms of the politicization of defense investment decisions. We've seen some really egregious examples of political considerations completely obliterating any sense of the national interest in how things have been decided. And there are a couple of examples in the book that I point to. So in my view, this is on Parliament. It is in other countries, the parliaments have worked towards a better political consensus on defense policy objectives and major defense investment decisions. That doesn't mean there's always unanimity and there's no debate, and certainly there needs to be political discussion and differences of opinion are inevitable. But in my view, it's really the responsibility of our parliamentarians to put heads together and find what consensus is possible. Certainly, the parties most likely to form government, we need to have them singing off a similar sheet of music so that we don't see 180-degree turns at every election in terms of these defense investments. There are many defense investments that take years and even decades. A ship program can take a couple of decades to go from original planning to cutting steel to putting hulls in the water and sailors aboard them. This country simply cannot afford the kind of wastage we have seen at times of the defense dollars when a new government comes in and trashes everything that's been happening over the previous several years or a couple of decades even. So that's, to my mind, it's not something that anybody other than Parliament can really solve. Although I think Canadian citizens can play a significant role in indicating a diminished tolerance for the kind of grandstanding we have sometimes seen by parties.
Another interesting part or passage of your book I'd like to speak about. Some of your analysis suggests that in some cases, sole source or preferred supplier deals can sometimes provide better value than open competitive tendering. How should the government and the public maybe think about some of the assumptions that they have about what best practices are in procurement and what that means for defense?
That's an excellent question. And I think the way you termed it probably gives us some insight into what the answer is. So the best practices, let's not focus on what we think are best practices internally in this country. Let's look at what are best practices in democracies globally, and in particular among the Westminster democracies that are more similar policy frameworks to Canada. So Australia, the UK being major ones. And I think that if you look at all of those, you'll see some evolution. And in some cases, they have gone from sort of competitive, we'll just buy the best kit we can around the world. And most of them are moving now to a domestic focus with preferred suppliers, as you described them, identified in certain areas. So in Canada, we have such an arrangement. It's called the Munitions Supply Program, and we have designated national suppliers for many types of not all, but many types of military ammunition for small arms weapons. And the government will go there first to acquire the range of products that it has been agreed these companies will supply to the government of Canada. There's they use a strategic sourcing agreement so that the government is funding the surge industrial capability by those companies. And that investment has paid off, certainly in Afghanistan, during the Afghanistan war. Canadian ammunition suppliers, in some cases, as much as quintuple their production, at the same time having the production lead times, their delivery lead times, in order to meet surging Canadian Armed Forces demand for those particular ammunition natures. So that works. It's not necessarily cheap, but it's also it avoids the very expensive cost of running out of something that you need in the middle of important operations. And we certainly had other natures during the Afghanistan war that were not part of the munition supply program that there was a lot of scrambling to try and source product at a time when all the other countries who were in Afghanistan were looking for similar products or the same products. So there's a lesson here in that when our demand for military hardware or supplies goes up, probably so is everybody else's. And so we need to think through an industrial strategy to how do we support the Canadian Armed Forces in these more intensive periods as we look to a future where it's increasingly the potential for a considerable need for military defense industrial capability is only going up.
Could you get a little bit more into describing what exactly Canada's approach to defense industrial policy is, and maybe the benefits of that approach or strategy, and maybe how the strategy could be better optimized?
Sure. So basically, Canadian defense industrial strategy, with the exception of things like the munition supply program, which I mentioned, has been to not have a defense industrial strategy. There has been debate, sort of the Canadian Association of Defense and Securities Industries has done papers over the last couple of decades, and the governments did adopt a concept of key industrial strategies, but this was it didn't reflect a coherent, strategically developed defense industrial strategy aimed at achieving particular national industrial capabilities. Other countries do have such strategies, and I think it'd be useful for Canada, as it is working now on it. The Our North Strong and Free defense policy update from a couple of years ago triggered a process to develop a defense industrial approach, and there are good examples in other countries. Again, I've mentioned UK and Australia. There are some other ones in Europe, the Netherlands, Germany. So we can look to other examples for how we might want to approach this. It's complicated for Canada because of our long-standing defense industrial cooperation with the U.S., which has been very effective in a lot of ways. We're kind of nervous about what it means right now, I know. The thing is, though, the defense industrial strategy has to have a very long time horizon in front of it, and there is a significant risk in overly coloring it with the short-term upheavals that we are going through with the Trump administration. The Trump administration at some point will either evolve into some other some other form, or at the end of his term, in all likelihood, will be replaced by something completely different, which we can't predict yet. So we have to do some serious strategic long-term thinking about the future, which is very, very cloudy.
Your use of the word evolve there is interesting and of note. I'm just kidding, but Chuck, something you didn't really mention in your book, but would be good to talk about just for the timeliness, due to this subject you just brought up, is Canada's involvement potentially in rearm Europe or Readiness 2030. We have these complications that I'm sure we don't need to go in depth about with our neighbors and allies to the south right now. And some of the changes that the Trump administration is ushering in on a global stage in the bilateral relationship. There's been a lot of talk about the necessity for Canada to join an arrangement such as rearm. There's also been some voices speaking out against that even though there are changes right now in the bilateral relationship, we share a long border and a massive geography with the United States and our futures there, and that we will always be connected with them defensively. What is your take on potential involvement in something like the rearm initiative?
I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. I think we need to understand that the defense of North America, in concert with our American neighbors, comes with certain requirements for interoperability, and a much higher level of interoperability between Canadian and American capabilities than would be the case, for example, in the battle group in Latvia. So the seamless sharing of data that is achievable now with the F-35 platform, in my understanding, can't really be done with any other alternative aircraft that's likely to be available in the next few years. The ability of the Navy to seamlessly interoperate and share real-time data with the U.S. Navy is absolutely critical. If you're hunting a Russian or a Chinese or a North Korean submarine, you got to be able to work seamlessly together. You've got to be able to have second-to-second real-time data sharing between the forces that are employed in that operation. So, given that the defense of North America and the defense of Canada are what I view as no-fail tasks, we need to make sure that we are as seamlessly interoperable with our American neighbors as we can be in everything we do around that. Where we have more options is in the international, the abroad kind of parts of mission. And there are things that we don't need to be fully interoperable with particularly any one country. We need to be sort of generally interoperable with a whole bunch of them, and that's what we see in Latvia. Canadian tanks don't have to necessarily be fully interoperable with the U.S. Stryker Brigade. Although it might be valuable to be able to do that, but it may not be as mission critical as it is in the defense of maritime and air approaches to North America. So I would say, yeah, let's look for opportunities where it makes sense for us to partner with the European friends. We might want to even start partnering with some of our Asian friends, and certainly the South Koreans are interested in selling us a submarine, but let's talk about it.
Chuck, I had one more question planned as part of our discussion for the podcast. But before I do that, you know, obviously we haven't been able to get through all the major details of your wonderful new book you've just written. But we've tried to touch on some of the major contours and areas of interest for our audience: NATO spending, defense procurement, industrial base. Before I move on to my final question, I want to ask you if there's anything else you'd like to speak to, or that you think is really pertinent about your book that maybe we glossed over a little too quickly, or not at all.
Actually, I think you did a really good job taking me for the whole thing. I guess the one thing I'd like to emphasize is the critical role of the informed and engaged citizen. And there's a chapter in the book that focuses on that. And there's a lot that the average citizen can do if they're interested. Recognizing that we all have a gazillion things that we're focused on in our lives. And not every citizen is going to have defense sort of in their top 5 or top 10, and that's fine. That's good. Citizens can engage at kind of a minimal level. That's just they might sort of read the newspapers or watch whatever news source they're interested in, and just make mental notes of things. And then around election time, might have some questions that the book has helped them to frame when canvassers or candidates come around to the door. So that might be the only active engagement that they involve. Others may want to write emails to their member of parliament or to their constituency office, or buttonhole their member of parliament at a summer barbecue event or something, and that's good too. The key idea here is for the citizen to recognize that they have a fundamental role, and our politicians see everything through political lenses. And that's not good, that's not bad, that's just is what it is. But it means that we as citizens are kind of like the water within which the political fish swim. And we need to understand our role in kind of shaping the priorities and the policy perspectives that our politicians develop. And so we just need to be conscious of that as we are, making our comments and doing whatever interventions we want to do, or ignoring issues. It's up to us collectively as citizens to think about the political environment that we are creating in this country.
One final question, Chuck, and your answer there might actually bleed a little bit into this next one. But we started this conversation with a bit of an overview of your career in national defense. Based on your experiences throughout your career, what are the biggest challenges? Not just in your career, but in your general observations as a practitioner and expert in this field. What are the biggest challenges and opportunities you see for Canada's defense posture within the next decade? And what are some key actions you think the governments and citizens alike can prioritize to ensure that Canada remains a country that is both secure but also influential on the world stage?
I think the single most important change, it is a real change that we have to see within our government, is to move from, as I mentioned before, a transactional approach to defense issues. So just waiting until they're forced to make a decision about a particular investment, or not make a decision, towards a more proactive, planned, strategic management approach, where key decision points are mapped out over a long period of time. That the central agencies of government are disciplining the various departments that have to be involved in those decisions to make sure that the information goes to ministers in plenty of time so that that they have a chance to assess the facts and understand the key questions that they have to decide, and enable them to make good decisions in a timely manner that provides for a good continuity of defense capabilities going forward. We can't afford to have the rust out events that we have seen, submarines, where we had like a 4, 5, 6 year gap between the retirement of the last Oberon submarine because it could no longer be operated safely, and the first single Victoria-class submarine having a crew and able to actually go to sea. With continuing gaps in the Victoria-class fleet capability and availability over the last number of years, ever since they were in service, there have been gaps where there were no boats available to go. We can't afford to have the last of our replenishment ships retired because it rusted out a decade before the replacements will come on board. We can't afford to have a CF-18, a fighter fleet, which is critical to that no-fail task of defense in North America, becoming ineffective or at significant risk of becoming ineffective in some of the key roles that it has, because it has just become too old, has been around too long, is too difficult to maintain. Serviceability rates are way down. We can't afford to do that in the future. The world has significant risk of delivering major consequences to this nation if we don't up our game in the strategic management of our defense capabilities.
Chuck, thank you for partaking in a wonderful, rich, and informative discussion today. I really hope that we were able to do the contents of your book justice. Thanks for everything that you've done throughout your long career for the defense of our nation. And thanks also for being a long time and very engaged CDAI fellow. We really appreciate you and the work that you are doing for us and for our audience. Please, I implore you and encourage you to pick up a copy of Mr. Davies' work, his book, True North Strong, A Canadian Citizen's Guide to National Defense. And once again, it aims to provide ordinary Canadians with a readable, plain language guidebook to help them answer fundamental questions and help them make informed judgments on defense issues. Importantly, in a way that I don't think seeks to influence how they think about defense or look at our institutions, but rather provide them with the knowledge they need to make informed decisions about defense. So Chuck, thanks once again so much for joining us today.
Thanks. It's been a lot of fun. I always appreciate talking to you, Josh.
And that's all for today's episode. The Expert Series is usually released every Tuesday and Thursday, but we'll be taking a bit of a break this summer and releasing one podcast a week. If you want to learn more about the CDA Institute, follow us on social media, visit our website at cdainstitute.ca, or subscribe to our newsletter for the latest updates on Canadian defense and international security. If you have comments or feedback about what you heard in today's edition, email josh@cdainstitute.ca. I'm Josh Malm. Until next time.